And then we ended up with these stereotypes and these tropes about drunken Indians or lazy Indians. Well, you know what? You took away everything that they did. You took away the way that they earned a living. You took away their purpose, the way that they provided for their family. You took away the way that they celebrated their heritage. And now you have the nerve to call them lazy. You know, that's a no.
Welcome back to That's Church. I'm Maisie, and my mom and aunt are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, just like me. They go around Utah discovering and interviewing various churches. I'm so excited and intrigued to learn with them about our neighbors and their religions.
Isn't she just the cutest? Now I'm excited to introduce our special guest for today's episode, and be sure to listen to the very end for a short sneak peek for the next episode, part 2, and also the episode after that with Aubrey Chavez. It's going to be amazing. Mary Wagner was born and raised in Arizona, spending most of her formative years in Window Rock, the capital of the Navajo Nation. After leaving Window Rock, she lived in Missouri, where her mother is from, experiencing a very different way of life alongside her 7 brothers and 2 sisters. A few years later, they moved back to Arizona. Mary eventually married, had 4 children, finished college, then completed an MBA after her divorce. She spent 2 years in Denver and is now enjoying life in Southern California. Mary has worked in tribal law, contributing her expertise to support Native American communities. She enjoys spending time with her 4 grown children, learning, traveling, and communing with the sand and waves. Mary strives to live everything better than she found it, whether it's her former places of employment, former homes, or the world we live in. Enjoy the episode. You please share with us a little bit about what it was like growing up on the Navajo Nation. How do you say that? Navajo Nations?
Navajo, the Navajo, it was the reservation. Yeah, Navajo.
Okay. Navajo Reservation.
Yes, yeah.
And how do you feel that kind of shaped your environment or your beliefs?
So I would say that was critical growing up as a child on the reservation as a non-native. 2 factors. One, I didn't realize there were a whole bunch of white people in the world. And 2, I grew up with no television either. So not having television and growing up in an environment that was very much about the people of, the Navajo people as opposed to white people, which is what we see everywhere else, right? So I grew up in an environment that was far less focused on the power structure of patriarchy, if that makes sense, as it is outside of the reservation. That's not to say it wasn't there, but it was just different. The second thing about that was growing up knowing that there were predominantly other spiritual practices in that environment. Now, a little bit more in depth about that is that my mother grew up not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And my father, although he grew up in the church, he was raised by somebody who was not raised in the church and was instead raised by in the Christian Science religion. So I was very interesting religious background. Because of that, I was raised to have respect for other people's religious beliefs, whatever they may be. For the most part. I mean, there's always going to be this level of, this is the true church, blah, blah, blah. For the most part, we're taught that, there's other religions out there. We should be respectful of those religions and their beliefs. So because of that, growing up on the reservation with a predominantly a spiritual belief that really existed outside of Christianity in an environment that really existed outside of whiteness, it was a hugely different experience for me than when I left the reservation and all of a sudden was entrenched in this white patriarchal Christianity, etc. So I realized later on that what was really critical about that, in addition to being exposed to a more diverse cultural experience than I ever would have again, well, until maybe now, in addition to that, and in addition learning the things, those things didn't really mean to me then what they mean now. For example, we grew up singing. We would go to school and go to music class, which, I don't think they really do music classes anymore, but we were taught to sing songs in Navajo. And we were taught to sing these songs. And, the only one I can really remember now was about the sun, the spring, and bringing rain down on the flowers to give them life. So that was the kind of messaging that we were taught. It was more of a shift away from structure and more into mother, father, son, and that kind of a dynamic. So I was too young to have walked away from that with a fully fledged understanding of that ideology. Also old enough to have had that ingrained in me so that when we left that environment, it was really sort of shell shock as far as, it affected me. So my younger siblings didn't really have that same thing. They didn't really have that same dynamic. But the siblings who are closest to me in age, there's 10 kids in my family. So, it's just all over.
That's a big one.
I'll tell you the scary part is my mom was 33 years old when she had her 10th child.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's a big pause. That's a big no for me, but more power to her.
How
old did
started
she
young
start?
then?
Yeah.
Well, they got married. Let's see. Oh gosh. This is one of those stories that when people talk about like church history and people with plural marriages and age differences, this is one of those things where it makes me cringe a little bit to tell this, but my mom turned 16 in October and they got married in November. And my dad he was a returned missionary. So he was 21.
So she
Not
was just barely not 15.
she
Wow.
she had one kid before she graduated from high school, and her second she had after she'd been out of high school for about a month. She graduated in May, he was born in June. So yeah, that was very much
And did they live on the reservation at that age?
no, when I was about 2, we moved to the reservation. So at that time they weren't, but it wasn't too much longer that they did.
Wow. And at least it's not a 45-year-old with a 15-year-old.
Oh, I know. It could
be
yeah,
worse.
yeah. It could definitely be
Because
worse.
that age difference doesn't matter later on, but when
Yeah,
they are that young, it's a little.
for sure. It's one of those things where it's like, was she old enough to really understand what she was getting into? Absolutely not. But then again, do any of us when we're even in our early 20s getting married? No, we don't. That's, one of those things where I'm like, we should all be maybe a little older before we get married and have kids. Have some time to process that. But that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what I would say overall about the reservation is that it really gave me a great foundation for understanding and appreciating different people in different cultures with different religious and spiritual beliefs, and an acknowledgement that there are other spiritual beliefs out there that maybe you don't partake in, but that are healthy and good, if that makes sense.
Oh,
So, yeah.
Amen. That was beautiful. Yes, amen. Everything about that, we totally 100% agree. And so cool that you were able to grow up with that, because here, I think in the Utah culture, it's very different. We were definitely raised, and I'm sure that was a big culture shock, because it's totally opposite. I think the way that we were raised, and we kind of had to get older to realize, like, oh, wait, this is actually, and our grandparents were in a mixed faith marriage, but still, and so we had like dabbles of that, but it still was kind of ingrained with us that it was scary to really delve into other churches or research or let them in, and so I love that you were raised that way.
So I just wanted to clarify one point, which is that my parents were really like, be open and understanding, but that did not mean that they would have been okay with us if we'd like decided, I'm just not going to go to the Mormon church anymore. That was a big no. We were still very, very entrenched in Mormonism, and very much that was what you did. And very much that even though we respect all these other religions and have respect for people's beliefs, they're still wrong and we're still right. So there's definitely still that aspect of Mormonism was still very much a part of my growing up. So it's weird, but it did set the foundation, which maybe we'll get into later. But it really did set the foundation for my later years as far as being more open and understanding for other people. Again, diversity, religious beliefs, etc.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
Can I ask what made them want to move to the reservation?
This is actually a very non-exciting part of the story. But my dad worked for this company called FedMart that was in the Southwest at the time. And I would describe FedMart now as being like a super Target or a super Walmart. So that's what brought my parents to Window Rock, was that my dad worked for FedMart and they transferred him to the Window Rock store. That was the next step for my dad in his career, was to take that promotion. So, yeah.
No, that's good to know.
Now I'm going to tell you as a follow-up to that, just real quick, that the reason we left the reservation was because a different company came in and bought out the FedMart stores. So when that happened, the owner of FedMart asked my dad if he wanted to join in on this new venture. My dad said no, because it would have required him moving his 10 kids, oh gosh, to San Francisco. So instead, my dad took us to Missouri, which was the worst thing that ever happened. Well, it's not the worst thing that happened to me in my whole entire life, but up till that point, that was horrible. It was horrible living in Missouri. We'll probably talk about that more later.
It's so cool that you got to grow up on a reservation.
Yeah. It was really, truly the coolest thing. I have, in my yearbook, my 8th grade yearbook, pictures of all of my friends, and it's just the experience of growing up with going to powwows, going to the Indian rodeos, going to the fairs that took place in Window Rock all the time, because that was the capital of the Navajo Nation. So pictures and seeing all the women in their native dress, speaking Navajo to everybody, that, sitting over open fires to make fry bread, which according to everybody's the only way to make fry bread is in lard over an open fire, right? But and just feeding you, and this, like going to my friends' family's hogans, seeing these little tiny hogans with 10, 15 people living in the one room hogan. And they're usually built with the fireplace in the center and then the chimney going up through the center for smoke. But going and playing just out on the reservation, out on the land all day. I obviously grew up in the 70s and 80s, and that's what you did. You just went outside and did what you needed to do. So having that experience where we just roamed the land, where my friends' grandparents were still herding sheep and we would go and help do that, where my friend's grandma was sitting down at a loom and weaving, and seeing all of that history and culture, and seeing the silversmiths, although that wasn't super common for me to see, but every once in a while somebody's uncle was a silversmith or whatever and would sit and be forging jewelry that had a connection to him and his family, not just something to look pretty or sell, which certainly was a factor at different points in time, but forging something that had a special connection. And I remember going to one of my friends to her family's gathering in her grandma's hogan, and just the smell of mutton, which can be a really strong smell. If you're familiar, you know what I mean. And just so I will always associate, like when I would drive from Mesa up to Utah for any reason and drive through the reservation, it's just, that's my home. That is a teary moment for me, because even though I haven't lived there for, several decades now, that's just where I was raised. And that's where I feel that connection to my roots, such as they may be. Because living in Missouri, everywhere I've lived since has been really a disconnect for me compared to how I grew up on the reservation. So it was just really, truly a remarkable way to grow up, to be able to grow up and see, again, just everyone's grandma, everyone's aunties. It's a very, very much a matriarchal society. So just seeing the woman seeing the woman connect, it was very much a community. It wasn't like, oh, here's so-and-so's kid they're waiting for a ride home from school. Oh, well, guess they have. No, it's like, oh, so-and-so's kid, come on with us. We'll just drive you down the road, and it was very much an all in for everybody sort of deal, as opposed to when I left the reservation and you go and live somewhere else and it's very disjointed, like here's this neighborhood, here's that neighborhood. It was very different. So again, looking back through the high school year, my eighth grade yearbook and seeing the pictures of being at the fair and the being at the powwows and just seeing everyone in their dress. And it's really just, I don't know how to put that in words, but it's just something that's really meaningful to me because that's my childhood. That meant something to me. And I always thought it was cool, just so beautiful, the dresses, the velvet, skirts and the squash blossom necklaces and things like that. Just so beautiful and so awesome. And I loved it. I loved every minute of it. You asked an embarrassing story. My one embarrassing story that I can think of has to do with the reservation. And I'll just tell you that now. But if you need to circle around later, you can. But when I was on the reservation, we just ran off and did whatever we were going to do all day long, right? So I'll tell you two stories, actually. We lived behind the church. We would go into the church. It was unlocked all the time. And we would do all sorts of stuff inside the church, like baptize each other in the font.
Oh.
Pass the sacrament to each other.
Oh,
We just did all the stuff.
That is amazing.
We would bless the sacrament. We did all of that. It's
good practice.
It was definitely good practice. And definitely for those of us who were girls who were like, it didn't even occur to us that maybe we couldn't or shouldn't. We just did. We're like, oh, hey, let's play baptism. Okay, you baptize me and then I'll baptize you.
Yeah.
That's what we did. So that's one little story from the reservation.
So
Another one not quite so cute. So my brother, who's closest in age, and we were super close when we were growing up, and we're still really close. But he and I we were the ones who were always wandering around together, doing whatever, getting in trouble. And came home one day that we're like, oh, hey, the field's flooded. The field in front of our house, but behind the church. The field's flooded. Let's go get our swimming suits on and play in the water, which we did.
Of course.
Later on, it's getting dark. My mom is like yelling out the door for us to come inside. Like, fine, we're going to come inside. So we go to the door. My mom about lost her mind because we had been playing in the sewer runoff. Yeah.
Oh, no.
I just can't even. I mean, as a child, it did not even occur to us. We did not think twice about it. There was nothing about that even slightly seemed problematic to us. Really? We were just playing in the water. That's it.
Much fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's wrong, Mom?
What's wrong? Much fun. Yeah. Let's go swimming.
Let's go swimming.
We were very young. We'll just say,
That's so funny.
I can just picture Mom's face, like,
yeah.
She was not happy.
Yeah.
So I think she hosed us down outside on the porch, and we had to, get all cleaned off first, and then go straight to the bathtub and take a shower.
You said that it's kind of more matriarchal. So, like, when I picture a reservation, and forgive me if this is inappropriate, I don't know what it's like nowadays, but was there like a chief or like a leader of sorts over the people, or how did that work?
Well, so they definitely, by that time, of course, there definitely had been more of a movement towards a more Western style of governance. So there was a chairman. So, and, there were a couple of chairmen but the Navajo Nation is huge. It's the largest reservation in the United States, population-wise and land-wise. If you look it up on the map, you'll see. It is huge and it encompasses the whole Four Corners area. And so there was always a chairman. Like every time if we got straight A's, we would get a letter from the chairman. So Peter McDonald was the chairman back when I was growing up. And I have tons of letters from him. And then it was Peterson Zaw. But I have these letters and, so they had a council. So they'd have the chairman and the council. And that was over the whole community, but this massive, like, it's like saying there's a governor of the state. It wasn't very local like. So when I say that it's a matriarchal society, that's traditionally the women were in charge of the goings on. And in fact, history, if you go back and read, there's this book called that really talks about what the Americas were like pre-Columbus. And that's one of the things that it talked about was how part of the problem when we had white explorers coming over or European explorers coming over and seeing women in charge, that was really problematic for many of these explorers, and for different reasons. People like that who are looking for power will find really any way to justify whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish, right? So one of the reasons that they used to justify some of their behavior was the women are the ones working in the field and the men aren't doing anything, right? They're just being lazy or whatever, because they didn't see the men. The men were out hunting, women were gathering or whatever. Different tribes had it set up different ways.
Yeah.
But that was one of the things that they used as an excuse to Christianize or to conquer Native American people or indigenous people. So,
Interesting.
on the reservation. And also, this is something that I wasn't really super aware of at the time I was growing up on the reservation, but the impact of reservation boarding schools cannot be understated. The impact of having your children taken away from you when they're 4 years old and them being forced to go to these government boarding schools that were run by Catholics usually. And even in the church, this is a huge cringy thing for me. But even in the church, when Spencer W. Kimball really promoted the Indian placement program, where tribal kids would go and live with white kids, white families, because we needed to save them or whatever. It's just really, truly awful to think about. And the impact that still lingers to this day cannot be understated. Cannot. It is really awful what happened to these people who are just trying to live their lives and love their families.
This is something I wanted to ask you if you knew about it. I didn't know if you had very much background or knowledge about that whole thing, but I recently heard a talk by a gentleman that was part of that placement program. And he talked in a positive way about it. He was taken from his family and placed in a white home. And I just thought, oh my gosh, how traumatizing would that be to be taken from your family? Like, we think we're so much better. How can we think we are so much better than them to think that they would be better off if they're introduced to our ways? And this is so much later in time. This isn't like, 1400s or whatever.
Yeah.
This is during,
70s.
like I can't even wrap my mind around that. And actually my grandparents adopted they call the way they frame it, I really hate it. They call him their little adopted Indian boy rather than their son,
Oh God, that's horrifying.
That's the epitome of what we're saying here is
like
we'll save you, we'll teach you our ways. It would be so traumatizing. And like you mentioned, Mary, it was traumatizing for you to leave, and you left on much better terms than a lot of these youth. And so I'm sure you have a very soft spot in your heart having gone through a similar experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that anything that I went through can compare, and let's just be really frank that for some people, this would not have been traumatic, as perhaps, Emily was just saying that the gentleman that she heard giving a talk, if you're if you're, at some point, some kids process that differently than others. And for some, it's like, okay, it wasn't so bad. Look what I got from it, and also, there was this whole drive to get at some point, I think it was also in the 70s, but this whole drive to get people off the reservations into the city. So they would cities would give you a one-way ticket on a bus, but and literally families were leaving the reservations in droves during this time period that they were doing this. And that caused an even further disconnect from people and their heritage, their culture, their traditions, because they were just, being encouraged, coerced. Sometimes there were no opportunities on the reservations. There were no opportunities, so they almost had to. It wasn't until, well, I don't want to sit and speculate about when, because again, this is not something I'm super well versed about. But at some point, people started to want to reconnect with their roots and started making their way back to the reservation. And, I think that was a personal journey for them. And, different people did that at different times or not at all, or however it worked best for them. But, there's some shows that if you watch Reservation Dogs or if you watch like Fry Bread Face, or there's a book that a part-time Indian, this book that's about this, the author actually grew up in the city and then on summers would go back to the reservation. So, and he talks in this book about his experiences as the way he calls it, a part-time Indian, because half the family and during the summer he's living with his grandma on the reservation, and the difference and the dichotomy between those two experiences. So
Interesting.
that's, if
I'd love
anyone's
to read that.
interested in looking into further resources, that's what I would recommend, is that they read that book, that they Fry Bread Face. I think it's on Netflix. I have to double check, but those experiences really, affected the way that tribes kind of learned to work today. So today, tribes are very okay. The whole casinos started because that was a way for tribes to actually have a way to provide for themselves. Because literally, the United States did everything in their power to not allow them to be able to provide for themselves. And then we ended up with these stereotypes and these tropes about drunken Indians or lazy Indians. Well, you know what? You took away everything that they did. You took away the way that they earned a living. You took away their purpose, the way that they provided for their family. You took away the way that they celebrated their heritage. And now you have the nerve to call them lazy. That's a no. Absolutely a no. So, the way that they've evolved as far as a government or whatever. And some things, unfortunately, I think are so embedded that we don't even realize that they're a product of white men trying to hold sway over tribes. For example, blood quantum, which is actually, so the government would provide certain, supplies for tribes, right? So in order to be a member of that tribe, you had to prove that you had enough Indian blood that you were actually a member of that tribe. So in order to do that, you had to go through your genealogy, so prove that you were descended from these people or whatever. The problem with that is, then again, back in the 70s, they're encouraging everyone to leave the reservation. So then you have this whole generation of people who they were not marrying other tribal members. The blood quantum's diluted, and then they're no longer a member of the tribe, according to the standards of the government, which was not originally set forth by tribal governments, but rather was set forth by United States. So they did that because they didn't want to provide for these tribes, that they set them up on this reservation with no way to take care of themselves. So they were giving them subsistence goods, but didn't want to give it out too freely. So if you're, only 50% Navajo, well, maybe you don't get, free clothes or food, whatever. And I am, again, not an expert on that, the backstory of that. So I'm sure there are plenty of other people there who could speak to that more. Even today, though, so many people in the Cherokee tribe who cannot get acknowledgement, for their tribe, or that they are tribal members. Some of them, there's a lot of members of the Cherokee tribe who actually have some African American heritage also. And they've really struggled to find recognition as tribal members because they're trying to meet this really, frankly, stupid goal that white people gave them, that told them that they had to meet to prove that they were really a member of the tribe. But just over the generations, that's become so embedded that now it's even for tribal councils, that's a thing. So most tribes have some variation of that. And now you have to be a tribal member to benefit from the casinos. Each states will have compacts with different tribes. So they'll have these tribal compacts to be allowed to have these casinos on their land. So, for example, California, I mean, there's so many tribes in California, I couldn't even count them all, but each tribe has to have a compact with the state in order to be allowed. And they have to agree to give a percentage of all their revenue to the state. or else they're not allowed to run these casinos on their own sovereign land, right? Again, just an overview.
Yeah.
But, so in order to be able to benefit from the revenue from these casinos, you have to be a registered member of the tribe. And again, the fewer members of the tribe now, the more money there is to go around. And some tribes are really better about that than others. Some tribes just really struggle with it. But that's another aspect of having this whole blood quantum thing, is that now profits from casinos, although they largely go to communities, they go to like, okay, we're going to, use this money for a school, use this money for a medical clinic. So I don't want it to sound like individual members of tribes are really raking in money from casinos, but it does have an effect in the revenue sharing, because they have to agree with these states to give them a pretty sizable amount of their revenues in order to be allowed to run their casinos on their own land.
I'm just writing down questions I have as you're talking, and this is kind of backwards, but I'm just curious. It sounds like you felt fully accepted on the reservation, but as a white person, did you, and were both your parents white?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So did you feel fully accepted, or did you feel a little bit like, did you feel the sting of minority, or how does
No,
that?
I never did. I think as a white person, you'd be hard pressed to really feel the sting of minority, just by nature of the fact that everybody else knows you're white. Everybody else knows there's something different about being white. The adults in the room know that you're the white kid, you're the daughter of the white guy, so there's never going to be an equal playing field. So I never, ever felt anything other than, hey, I had a bunch of friends, we ran around and had fun together. Never, ever did it ever really factor to me in that way, that, oh, I'm white, oh my gosh, I don't belong. Never. But I don't think it's a fair analogy to say that, if I'd been a Native American child in a room full of white people, that probably would not have been the same. I don't know. I can't speak for anyone who's Native American, obviously, but for me, from my perspective, I never felt excluded at all. But I also don't think that there was any way that I could have felt like I didn't belong. The only time, and this is the dumbest thing ever, the only time I ever felt like left out, this is really so stupid. But every year, kids who are tribal members would get some clothing, like a jacket or some. And I don't know anything about it other than it was part of the distribution of, to tribal members, to kids who needed, clothing. And I was jealous. I was like, why are they getting clothes? And I had no idea. I just didn't know that was because when people are in poverty, they might need help with some clothes. And you're not in poverty, Mary, because your dad, manages this department store full of clothes. So it was completely different. But that's
really sweet. That's a very sweet and innocent story.
My kids, we live in a low income area, and my kids go to a Title I school, and they'll often be given cereal and stuff. And my kids always come home with cereal, and I'm like, don't take it. It's for the other kids. But after a while, I stopped saying it, because I'm like, I'm sure they want to be like everyone else, and they're giving it to everyone, and they say like everyone should take it. And there's other options too. Like there's like a food pantry that comes sometimes. It's really awesome. We get free lunch. It's really great. And it doesn't matter what your income is. It's just if you live in the area, you get free lunch. And anyway, but that's a cool story, because I think I have seen that with my kids before, like that they've been like, why can't we take the cereal?
Yeah, they're just like, oh, hey, they're giving out free cereal. I want free cereal.
Yeah. That's so cute. Yeah, I love it. I thought of the word, it's arrogant. Such a simple, dumb word. But as soon as I can never think of that word. And as soon as I can't, then I can't think of any words that are related to it.
Of course. But it really truly is a very arrogant thought process. And how, literally, when we talk about humility and how important it is to be humble yourself, lest, the Lord cause you to be humbled or whatever. And yet there was this whole swath of conquering Europeans who were like, oh, I'm doing the Lord's work by, and, I'm sorry, and all these people. Really? Seriously? You think that's God's work? I'm just going to go through and decimate an entire, nation, an entire nation, because I'm doing God's work. The arrogance, that is exactly the right word. Just the hubris of thinking that is in any way, shape, or form going to be acceptable is just beyond me. I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when we look at something that's different, the natural man in us, it just wants to be like, to have fear over it. And so we assume like they're wrong. Why would they do that? And it makes me think when you said that people call people on the reservations lazy, like
Yeah.
it also is just a different lifestyle, even when it was at its fullest, when they were living life and living
Right.
in their way. It was so different, I'm sure, than someone who goes and works from 9 to 5 and is just busting
Yeah.
it all day long. Like, yes, I'm sure they're also working on the reservation, but it's going to look differently. It's a totally
Yeah.
different lifestyle. And I think we don't always leave room for admiring different lifestyles. And there's so much beauty and growth in that. We don't all have to do things the same way.
Right. Right. That's absolutely correct. I mean, just trying to homogenize entire groups of people is really, truly ridiculous. I mean, we don't want anyone to be different. We want everybody to look and act just like we think it's the right way to look and act. And I don't know if either of you follow Sharon McMahon, her Instagram account at Sharon Says So. But that's one of the things she says she's so great. But one of the things that she says over and over again is what can be used for you can be used against you. And if you're going to spend all your time thinking, oh, we want everybody to look and act just like us, we're going to force everyone. Okay, well, we've all seen the results of that. Genocide in, Germany, genocide in Rwanda, genocide here that the United States did against Native American tribes, genocide and like Christopher Columbus when he came over and just decimated entire populations of peoples. It's really, truly just despicable.
It's like, when will we learn? How many times do we have to do it?
I know.
I
Well,
don't remember where I heard this phrase, but it was, we mistake unity for uniformity, and they're different things. And we
yes,
cannot try to force someone to be just like we are. And unity really is about embracing all beliefs, and not embracing them like you have to take it on yourself, but just respecting them. Respect
yeah,
everyone's beliefs, and that will equal true unity.
that's exactly right. And that is really, truly the bottom line is we're supposed to respect each other. And you know what? You cannot say that you think we are all sons and daughters of God and then also expect that they should not be allowed to live the way that they choose to live. You cannot say that you believe truly in free agency and then work to take everyone else's free agency away from them. You cannot do that.
Amen.
Those two things do not work the same. They just don't. They're not meant to be together.
How old were you when you left the reservation?
So we left when I was 12. We had just finished 7th grade and I started 8th grade in Missouri. We had the summer in Missouri. And let me just tell you, like we go to Missouri, it's the heat and humidity of summer in Missouri. And I knew nobody. We lived 20 minutes away for outside of town. And so there was like, you walked outside of your house. I could walk down the road a quarter mile to my grandparents' house or down a little bit further to my other uncle's house. And it was just truly like, that was it. If I wanted to go anywhere, do anything, you had to get in the car and drive, which is not a unique experience for a lot of Americans, right? I mean, I think now we live in these suburban areas, at least I do. And, there's people everywhere. There's grocery stores, there's cars, there's everything. But not where I was. I definitely didn't have that Window Rock, which I didn't really care about at the time. I was young enough and my friends lived the little development where it wasn't a development. We lived in trailers. I just want to make that clear. But there was this little community of trailers, and we were living in the lap of luxury in a double wide. But my friend lived, a few coupled, like 2 trailers down. There were people all up and down that road, and then we go to Missouri and we were so far away from everybody. There was no way that I could have, met anybody I was going to go to school with or gotten to know anybody. So it was a very long, lonely summer. And
Imagine.
yeah, and also it was gross because then that's when I learned about ticks. And there is never been a grosser thing than ticks and cockroaches. I had no idea what they were, had no idea they existed, and I spent all summer just staying inside, like huddling in a corner practically, like, oh my gosh, please don't let those things anywhere near me. So that first summer was really terrible, and it did not improve. So, at least for me, from my perspective, because I went to school and again, and just surrounded by white people, surrounded by whiteness, surrounded still in that day and age in the early 80s, still the idea that Black people should not be allowed to live in that town. And if they try to, we're going to take steps to prevent that. And also, side note, living near my mother's family, my mother did not want to move back to Missouri. I'm not going to get too much into that because that's her story, but she had a terrible childhood there. So she didn't want to go back. My dad really wanted us to go back to Missouri, partially so that she, in theory, could. I think I've done these air quotes like 500 times during these last 40 minutes, but so sorry.
But
sometimes they're appropriate. Anyway, so my dad wanted my mom to be able to spend time and be close to her parents while they were getting older. Fair, great. But he also wanted to bring her family into the church because that's what you do, right? So that, I think, was his goal. Noble or ignoble as it may have been, it did not go well. And I'm going to tell you that when I was young, we went to visit my Missouri relatives. And one of my uncles said to me and my brother, we were very young, but he said, "Oh, you're Mormon. You're going to grow up and have horns."
Oh.
And I was like, "No, we're not. My mommy and daddy don't have horns." He said, "That's because they grind them down." I was like, so I was like 7, maybe. I can't remember, but
shocking to hear as a child, though.
yeah. And this is what we moved into, a very, very entrenched Southern Baptist area. Lots of perfectly nice people. But my relatives, my uncles, were definitely not in any way, shape, or form. They looked at this as an opportunity to try to convince my mom that she made a mistake. She needed to leave the church and come back and join the fold of the Southern Baptist. So they're on this end and my dad's on this end and, just pushing and pulling at each other for 5 frickin' years is really what happened. And my dad, despite his best efforts, never was able to find really sustainable work there in Missouri. So in addition to the bugs and the religious drama, there was also just a complete inability to provide for 10 kids. Although my oldest brother left fairly soon because he turned 18 and went on a mission. So he was gone a couple years in. But after we'd been there for a few, like 2 or 3 years, and I'm just going to give credit to my parents. I mean, you know what? Honestly, they are human beings and they did some really dumb things and they made some mistakes, just like we all do, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes those things really affect you as your kids. I had a therapist once who said to me that everybody has to emancipate themselves from their parents. You have to do it from yours, and your kids are going to have to do it from you. And I have felt that so hard ever since he said that, because I really had to work to try to understand my parents and reconcile their actions with their love for us, or their purported love for us, because they didn't seem like they were the same thing, But we lived for 2 years with no running water, no electricity. I was in high school. My dad worked 2, 3 jobs sometimes, never ever could make it work while we were out there. And it was not fun at all. Not fun.
Sounds like a culture shock in every sense.
Super culture shock. I mean, truly a culture shock. And on top of that, like, when we were in Window Rock, we lived like behind the church for half the time, living in the trailer. We lived behind the church and we lived in that little neighborhood, but the church was always right there really close. We could get to it super easily, no problem. When we were in Missouri, when we first moved there, it was in town about 20 minutes away. But after about a year, they closed that little branch down. There just weren't people to take care of it. So eventually they moved it to a town like an hour away. And there was like 2 other girls my age or even remotely close to me in age that weren't my sisters, I should clarify. So even going to church was a challenge. And when you're making like no money, you have these kids to provide for and feed. And you have to pay gas to drive, an hour one way to get to church. But my parents did this. And this is where one of my huge crucial things came up for me was, my parents made sure that if they had $1, they paid 10 cents tithing. And here we were starving. Here we were with no running water, no electricity, but my parents were determined to pay their tithing. Never, ever, ever. And, so anytime anybody ever said, oh, well, these stories that people tell in church, well, we were so, we tried to pay this bill, had no money, but I knew if we paid our tithing, and then mysteriously there was this envelope in the mailbox full of money.
Yes, of course.
And I'm like, that, you know what? No. First of all, if you pay tithing, power to you. I respect you if that's what you feel like is the best thing for your life. But for me, when I was a child and my parents were so diligent about paying tithing, while we literally had no food to eat, that was like a huge, like, man, no. I think that there's no way you can be a member of the LDS church and not think that everywhere you go, you're going to be proselytizing. I just don't think there's a way to not, because that's what we're told constantly when we're growing up is, every member a missionary. I mean, who grew up with that? Or it just would be a good example. All this messaging that we've had our whole life, of course, that's absolutely what we were raised to expect that we would be doing, right? We're raised to absolutely go out there and invite your friends to church, whatever that looks like. I mean, I think that looks like different things for different people. There's some really positive things about that, positive things that you're out there for your community. You're interacting with people who probably really need a friendly face or whatever. There's also some downsides in that people's kids are told, well, my kid can't play with you because you're not a member of the church. I can't go on a date with you because you're not a member of the church. I can't do this because you're not a member of the church. How many times have we also heard that? So I think there's this whole push, again, every member a missionary, but at the same time, there's a danger in that mindset that you can actually cause harm to people who really, truly are not in a space to embrace that or look at that. And if you're pushing or if you're saying things to people that are harmful, like, sorry, can't play with you, not a member of the church. I mean, really, how does that feel if you're a kid and your friend down the street's like, oh, I can't play with you anymore because you're not a member of the church?
We were talking about your dad and how you felt like they still wanted you to be a part of the community, even though you were LDS.
Oh, yeah. So I guess the bottom line to my dad's background is that he was not raised in an environment where we're the true church. This is what you do. Go out and be a missionary. Because his dad didn't even start going to church until my dad was 12. So my dad was not raised with that dynamic. And so I think that was part of why my parents were a little more like, got to be understanding. We expect people to understand us and our religion. We need to understand and be respectful of other people's religions. So my dad, on the flip side, though, was very patriarchal in that this is what you do. You follow the prophet. You're the man of the family. You're the priesthood holder. You lead the family. And there wasn't really wiggle room in that regard. In fact, another story. My mom actually gave me a blessing when I was in high school. And my dad came home and it came up and she told him, and he was happy because that was not for her to do. And she explained to him, she's like, well, I read blah, blah, blah. And they went behind closed doors at that point. So I don't know what the conversation was. She never did it again. But I remember that she did that, and she did it because she had been taught or read somewhere in history that was what women used to do. That it was okay for women to do that. And so my dad was like having none of that, basically. So even though there was this whole dynamic of understanding and, hey, let's be appreciative of other religions and let them, do their thing, there was still this whole like, this is the way we do things, if that makes sense.
Still some expectations on
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you still keep in touch with people from the reservation?
Yeah, I do. Not as much as I did, but there's one person from the reservation that we reconnected as adults because I work in the legal field, and for a while I worked in tribal law. And so we reconnected at at the law firm that I worked at when I was doing tribal law. She was an attorney there. And I was like, oh, and we started talking and realized, oh my gosh, you were in Mr. John's class on the reservation. It's like, yes. So we were like, wow. And her dad knew my dad. And, we'd obviously gone our separate ways. She actually ended up being the judge who performed the ceremony when my oldest daughter got married. And so small world there.
So special.
There's a couple.
Cool.
Yeah, totally. And there's a couple of others, but it is a small number just partly because I was so young when we left.
Yeah. Probably not a lot of ways to stay connected when you're that young.
It's hard. It's hard, especially the older you get, it's like you have these layers, like here you are and you have all these friends. It's like you have capacity for 20 friends at a time max. And sometimes they just have to drop off.
Yes, totally.
Yes,
I totally
so
get that.
true.
Yeah. And this is kind of a dumb question. I just really am not very educated right now in this whole area, I guess. But right now, what is appropriate? Is Native American? Is that the most appropriate?
I wouldn't say so. And honestly, again, since I'm not part of that community, it's probably not appropriate for me to really expound on that. But what I will say is that it varies. A lawyer's favorite words, it depends. So some really are okay with Indian. And so we were for a long time saying tribal law, and then it kind of morphed into Indian law. And I think that's kind of in the legal field a little more standard. I think that some people are more careful to say Native American, but honestly, I think that they're not like Navajo. I'm going to totally say it wrong, but it's not. They don't call themselves Navajo. They're Dene, or however you say it. Like I said, I'm going to butcher it because it's been so long since I've had to say it. But if they're Dene and we're Belagana, white people, they're not saying they're Navajo. They're not Navajo. That's our word for them. So even in that context, they're the ones who tell you what they want to be referred to as. But I think there was a push for a while to not say Indian because really they're not from India either. We just have all these made up words for tribes because we, again, trying to get them to conform to whatever our little picture or expectations were of them. But they have their own names for themselves,
That's cool.
So, but I think generally speaking, saying Indian is okay for most tribes, most tribal members. But if you're close to somebody, just ask them,
Yeah. Love it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Good information to have.
Thank you for tuning in to That's Church. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at That's Church Podcast. We appreciate your support more than you know. Seriously, thank you so much. You can now unlock our locked episodes for just $2.99 a month by clicking on the lock and following the prompts. That is right on Apple Podcast or on Spotify. Every penny goes toward the production of our podcast. Next Wednesday, July 31st, we'll release part 2 of Mary's interview. In that coming episode, she delves into the egalitarian roles of men and women before the Industrial Revolution, the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, and the challenges faced by Native Americans conforming to our white world. We also discuss homeschooling, alternative learning within religion, and what eternity means to her. Plus, Mary shares her experiences fostering dogs, balancing personal needs with helping others, and taking care of the environment. We each share our thoughts and experiences with the LGBT community as well. Following that, we have an interview the next week with Aubrey Chavez, where we discuss her faith journey and her deconstruction and reconstruction process, her role and how it all started as a host for Faith Matters alongside her husband, Tim, and the importance of learning about other religions, of course. We also talk about the upcoming Restore Conference and what to expect. It is going to be incredible, like truly. Keep listening to each other and keep loving. Thanks again for your support, and see you next time.